My name is Dr. Joanne Bazubitz, and I'm proud to be President and CEO of the Royal, one of Canada's leading mental health and research centers, where clients receive best-in-class care informed by cutting-edge research so that they may live their best lives. I would like to thank Rogers TV for the opportunity to host our conversations at the Royal, where you will hear from many of our amazing clinicians and researchers who are passionate about the care they provide and the research that will lead to novel treatments and new discoveries in mental health and addictions. Today's session is about happiness with Dr. Tim Lau, a wonderful psychiatrist in our geriatric program at the Royal, and he's also president of our medical staff and on the board of trustees. He's a distinguished teacher and associate professor and has recently been appointed as Director of Joy at work for the Department of Psychiatry. As a leading educator, he has shaped psychiatric education and trained a new generation of psychiatrists in Canada. Dr. Lau is a sought-after speaker nationally on happiness and parenting and on spirituality, drawing on his experience as a psychiatrist, husband, and a father of 6 children. Yes, 6. He has won several awards locally and nationally in recognition of his teaching, mentorship, and advocacy, and is deeply appreciated by clients and families at the Royal. Dr. Lau will discuss what science can tell us about happiness and what he has learned over the years of caring for elderly patients. Let's learn more about his 7-item prescription for happiness for both storms and calm waters. I'm extremely pleased to introduce Dr. Lau.
Thank you. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm sharing a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I've been talking about happiness now for more than 10 years, and it started from a talk I gave here at the Royal, but since then I've given similar kinds of talks across the country related to happiness. I do think that as a specialty of medicine, psychiatry does have a tendency to focus on disorders and what is really broken rather than what is working. And I think that's an important thing for us to obviously help people with, is to get them going. But I think in the way to do that is in many ways to focus more on strengths rather than weaknesses, and to repair not just the worst parts of a person's life, but to build up the best parts of their life. And in many ways, I think it's good for us to, rather than making lives less horrible, helping people discover what's wonderful in their lives. And rather than just simply labeling and trying to fix pathology, promoting enduring happiness. There is a book by Chip and Dan Heath called Switch, which I think resonated with me, the concept of trying to copy success rather than just solving problems. So looking at what's working again is the focus rather than just what's broken. And the famous Nobel laureate Gabriel Marquez once said, "Happiness cures what medicine cannot." So some people ask the question, is it even possible to be happy in the middle of a global pandemic? I think it is clear to say every philosopher has commented about happiness, and I think we all realize that that's what we're searching for, whether or not we realize it or not. As the 17th century philosopher Blaise Pascal once said, even people who are trying to commit suicide are trying to be more happy. But we also have to recognize that it is in some ways a fuzzy concept. Even though we all want happiness, it's actually somewhat difficult to achieve. I mean, before the pandemic, think of the best and worst things that can happen to you, and I will illustrate for you why this concept is fuzzy. Would you be happier winning a lottery or breaking your neck? As I said, I think the answer would surprise you. And those two things, I think, for many people, reflect what would be the worst kinds of things. People wish that they would win a lottery, and they have the biggest fear that something like an accident would cause them to not be able to walk. Well, what happens after you win a lottery? I think people tend to be ecstatic at first, but it tends to have toxic effects on your relationships, especially if you didn't have money before. You start wondering about every person in your life who's calling you, and you become suspicious, and you doubt the people in your life. And what about when you break your neck? Well, a Harvard psychologist, his name is Dan Gilbert, did a study actually answering that very question about comparing people who have broken their neck and won lotteries. And the evidence surprisingly suggests that people who break their neck actually do fairly well afterwards. There's a period of tragic adjustment, but paraplegics generally are quite happy people. And a year later, the difference between lottery winners and paraplegics there is no difference. So I think that's a shocking thing. And it illustrates for us, for people, what they think will make them happy is actually not what will make them happy. I think we can predict what will happen, but sometimes it's just the very opposite. If you consider the situation in the world prior to the pandemic, in the last 5 to 7 decades, our average, the median adjusted income has more than doubled since 1930. And this graph just shows that the average income has gone up, but the percentage of very happy people has not gone up. And in fact, depression was on the rise before. The World Health Organization declared depression to be a global epidemic even before the pandemic of COVID-19. So there was a kind of stress that was internal, even though the stresses externally were less. People's quality of living and their incomes were going up, yet at the same time, their depression levels were going up and their anxiety levels were going up. This graph here shows that if you were born from 1905 to 1914, you were markedly less depressed than if you were to be born from 1955 to 1964 when corrected for your age. So it suggests that each decade we have looked at in terms of cohorts, the rates of depression and anxiety are going up. This graph of MMPIs, this is proprietary, it's a large data set of data done with college students. And you can see that from 1940 to 2010, rates of depression just had steadily gone up. And similarly, data from the American College Health Association shows the same thing. Rates of depression, rates of suicide have steadily gone up across different demographics. And we know that, especially for the youth, rates of suicide have gone up by 500 to 600% from 1950 to our present time. Now, you may wonder, during the pandemic, did rates of suicide increase? And we anticipated that they would. This is a paper by one of my colleagues, Roger McIntyre, and they predicted that rates of depression would be markedly increased as well as rates of suicide. And suicide was something that you could obtain statistics for, and we found that suicide actually didn't go up during the pandemic, at least not to this point. We obviously are worried that as time goes on that this might change. But this is data from Australia in the Lancet, showed that actually suicide rates went down at first. And this is similar to data in the States, in Massachusetts. Even after the stay-at-home orders, it didn't lead to rises in suicides, which is what we thought would happen. And there is an awareness, though, that mental health did decline in the context of stress. So people did experience more depressive and anxious symptoms since the pandemic began, but that didn't necessarily translate into hospitalizations or suicides. So when surveys are done, it is clear that people have depressive and anxious symptoms, which is kind of understandable because you're in the middle of the stressful situation itself. Now, there were some things that buffered the negative effects, and that included things like exercise, having religious service attendance and that kind of thing actually helped. If you look at, this is a study from the Journal of the American Medical Association, just comparing 2018 to 2020. And just as I was saying, rates of stress went up anywhere between 2 to 4 times higher than it was a year before. And again, this just reflects the fact that people were very stressed. So what happens when we are under tremendous stress? This is a picture of the Twin Towers. And, after this terrible event happened, there was an expectation that mental illness and the stress would lead to mental illness and depression and suicide. So much so that they developed debriefing teams and mental health supports. And they found that they actually weren't helpful. People didn't need it afterwards. It was more helpful to actually have targeted what they called mental health first aid. So just identifying people who were not doing well and helping them. Which is why I think it's important for us to be aware of our own mental health vital signs. If you're not sleeping, if you've stopped eating and you've lost your sense of humor and hope, then you need help. You may need professional help. But it comes to my point of mentioning this is that the circumstances of our life, whether or not it's a tragic event like the Twin Towers or a pandemic, the circumstances don't necessarily affect, as much as you would think, our levels of happiness or depression, for that matter. So this is a landmark paper in 2005 by someone from California, Sonia Lyubomirsky, who's tried to estimate the determinants of happiness. And what she and many other people have come to the conclusion is that happiness only depends maybe 10 to 15% on your circumstances or things that are external to you. So, and this comes from looking at aggregate twin data of people who are monozygotic or dizygotic twins, in other words, identical versus non-identical twins, and identical twins who are raised separately. So there are different ways of looking at the effects of genetics and the effects of circumstances. And the work of Ed Diener similarly supported this kind of finding that circumstances don't have as big an effect as you would think. Now, I think part of the problem with and why I think we were experiencing increasing rates of depression and less happiness prior to the pandemic is the definition of happiness and what we think makes us happy was in error. If you look at the pleasure principle from Epicurus, Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Sigmund Freud, they held that happiness was equal to pleasure minus pain. And in a pandemic, you can see why it would be so hard to envision being happy, simply because we are not able to experience pleasure in the same way because we can't do fun things as much. And many of us are experiencing more pain. So in the sense, it's kind of easy to see why happiness would be almost unattainable looking at that kind of definition. So how would you define happiness? I've asked auditoriums full of psychiatrists this question, and it actually is more elusive than you think. The modern sense of happiness is most often thought of as a subjective state, your emotional state. So it's a type of subjective contentment. And the word happiness, the origins of it come from the Old English word hap, which refers to fortune, good luck, or chance. So in this sense, happiness is something that happens to you and it's related to good fortune. So you can see that winning a lottery would fit along with that idea of being happy. But the ancients realized that happiness is not just based on circumstances. It was an internal thing. It involved choices. It involved virtue. It involved excellence. And the Greek word for happiness, eudaimonia, refers to this concept of human flourishing. And it is largely an internal thing. It doesn't depend on the circumstances of your life. Because the Greeks knew, if you have read any of the Greek tragedies, is that it is hard to predict the outcome based on something that happens. We actually don't really know what the outcome is going to be. That famous line by Solon, who said, "Judge no man wise until they are dead." We actually don't know what the circumstances will mean for us in our lives in the end. So there is a saying, you can't calm the storm, so stop trying. What you can do is calm yourself. The storm will pass. And the Greek notion of stoic ataraxis, or tranquility, is very similar to this concept of nirvana from the East. And it's similar in many ways to divine providence, just believing and trusting in things working out in the end. It is true that when we try to focus on and change things that we can't be happy. And there's no way, if we're in the middle of a storm, that we can stop the storm ourselves. But we can try to calm ourselves, which is an internal thing. And happiness, I will argue, is an inside thing. It's, as I was saying with the studies that suggest the determinants, really happiness is only 10% our circumstances. Many people think that, if I get this job, or if I get this promotion, or if this thing happens in a relationship, or if I get this new car or this new phone, I'll be happy. And the problem is those goalposts always change, because once you get those things, you realize that didn't make you happy. So the reality, though, is that if you were to, for example, find out that you got a raise of 5%, you might be very happy. But if you found out later that your colleague got a 10% raise, it would make you unhappy. It is an external thing for us. Sorry, it's an internal thing for us, even though external things happen that we may or may not be aware of. Epictetus, who was another Stoic philosopher, said, "We suffer not from the events in our lives, but from our judgment about them." Now, I'd like to give you a prescription for seeking happiness. And I'd like to start with the first prescription, which is to spend our time wisely. Many people think that the only thing we really spend in our lives is our time. When we spend money, or, you may actually get the money back, whereas time, once it's spent, it's gone forever. The Dalai Lama once said, "Man sacrifices his health in order to make money. Then he sacrifices money to recuperate his health. And then he is so anxious about the future that he does not enjoy the present. The result being that he does not live in the present or the future. He lives as if he is never going to die, then dies never having really lived." And Benjamin Franklin once said, "Money has never made man happy, nor will it. There is nothing in its nature to produce happiness. The more of it one has, the more of it one wants." Two researchers, Princeton economist Angus Deaton and psychologist Daniel Kahneman, actually asked that question, what is the perfect salary for happiness? And they did a survey of about 500,000 Americans from 2008 and 2009. They actually won the Nobel Prize in economics for this work. And they found that above 75,000, there does not seem to be an increase, or at least not much of an increase, in your day-to-day happiness with increases in salary. And this fellow, Podhave, wrote this book called The Happiness Equation, and he looked at the British household panel survey of more than 10,000 people starting in 1991, and he looked at surveys of life satisfaction and social relationships and income. And he asked the question, how much money would you have to give someone who hasn't seen his friends for almost a year in order for him to be as happy as a person who gets to see his friends every day? And you may be surprised that the answer is actually $300,000. So it is pretty clear that it is easier for us to see our friends every day than it is to make $300,000 a year. Now, in the pandemic, it's obviously harder to see your friends every day, but it doesn't mean you can't call your friends or see them via virtual means every day. The second prescription is to enhance connection. One of the most robust findings in the area of happiness is the importance of relationships. The Grant study, which was combined with the Gluick study to be part of the Harvard longitudinal study, was one of the longest longitudinal studies of human development. It started over 80 years ago now and has followed two groups of men, one from Harvard undergraduates and the other, they were boys in a Boston suburb. And the data from this large cohort over many years was that relationships made a huge difference in the trajectory of people's lives. Strong, warm relationships early on led to success, happiness, and resiliency. And more than that, it wasn't just early relationships that made a difference. Your relationships at the age of 50 predicted how long you would survive and whether or not you would develop dementia. And these were better predictors than some of the other tests we do in medicine, like your blood pressure, your cholesterol, or your blood sugars. Those are also predictors for mortality, but interestingly, relationships are an even stronger predictor. George Vallance, one of the psychiatrists that was part of the Grant study, he said that after 75 years and $20 million, they found that straightforward 5-word conclusion, and that happiness is love, full stop. Meaning relationships make all the difference in happiness. And that's the basis for interpersonal psychotherapy for depression in psychiatry that I practice. It's important for us to make strong personal relationships a priority because they are honestly what matters the most, and they help buffer against the damaging effects of life's letdowns and setbacks. I came across this book that talked about these beautiful equations, these 3 beautiful equations. This is one of the equations I think is really nice. The concept that joy is love minus fear. I think whenever you love something, that's actually when you can suffer. But the joy comes when the fear of losing that person is less, and you can experience that kind of joy in the middle of self-forgetful love. The empirical data supports this, the idea of relationships. This is published from The Lancet, and they looked at the UK Million Women study. It was a prospective 3-year study, and you can see that the things that help people become happy included their education level, the amount of exercise they did, whether or not they were married with children, and whether or not they practiced religion. In terms of negative determinants of happiness, so if you had problems sleeping, if you smoked, and if you had poverty, those were all things that made you less happy. Now, you might wonder, how do you sustain emotional connection with social distancing in the context of our pandemic? I think it's important for us to realize that it's still possible to be connected with people you love. In fact, we've learned how to do this in this last year, and we can learn to do it more and better. In fact, we've learned ways of doing things that it would never have happened if the pandemic had not occurred. Zoom, FaceTime, Skype, connections with families in other cities. We never did that to that level that we do now. And we can laugh together, we can cry together, we can truly be together. And humor, I think, is something that helps connect us. And I've learned to play games with people in different cities, and this connection is really important. The next prescription is to focus on excellence. And the ancients recognized this, and they saw that happiness is very much connected to virtue and the things that you do. The great minds of antiquity realized that their concept of human flourishing, or eudaimonia, is very much connected to virtue, including Epicurus, who is the father of hedonism. he realized that pleasure is in fact connected to eudaimonia. We experience pleasure when we experience fairness, and when we are courageous, and when we are able to exert self-control, and when we have wisdom. Eleanor Roosevelt once said, "Happiness is not a goal, it's a byproduct of a life well lived." So that's a good life and a happy life. The K prescription is for kindness. So this includes to other people and yourself. This is a study published in the Journal of Science, and they looked at two groups of students. They gave them increasing amounts of money, and they were instructed to spend money either on themselves or other people. And the group that spent money on themselves did not get happier at the end of the study. But those that spent money on other people, regardless of the amount, were happier. So this was a study that demonstrated that people are truly happier giving than receiving. And Martin Luther King, obviously before that, said something very similar. Those who are not looking for happiness are the most likely to find it, because those who are searching forget that the surest way to be happy is to seek the happiness of other people. I think this is a beautiful quote. To inspire people, don't show them your superpowers, show them theirs. There is a kind of kindness when you show people the light that they have within themselves. We need to empower other people. And the world's changed by our example, not by our opinion. Some people say, well, they don't think they have accomplished much. And this is a quote I think is very beautiful. It says, "Sometimes," said the boy, "I feel I haven't achieved anything." "You've been a friend," said the horse, which is a magnificent thing. You know, many of us don't realize the value of the friendships we have with other people, and people that we know don't realize how valuable their friendships are to us. You can change the trajectory of a person's life by being a good friend. And, you know, I think in this time of pandemic, it's hard for us to see people in person the same way, but there's something comforting and beautiful to know that they're there. And I think, you know, in the pandemic, I have reached out to people I haven't seen in decades, and I've reconnected. We can connect with people. We just have to find out how. This is a quote. It says, "Good friends are like stars. You don't always see them, but you always know that they're there." The fifth prescription is to improve our awareness, the way we think, the way we learn, to challenge ourselves. And I think Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he refers to this as sharpening the saw. In other words, helping us to continue to improve. You know, one of the things that people, when they are suffering from depression, is that they're not aware of where they're at and how they can come out of it. And part of what we do in psychiatry is we help people see. You know, if you mistakenly think you're useless, ugly, and unlovable, you'll end up feeling that way too. So if you have the wrong way of thinking, you'll have the wrong way of feeling. And we do need to try to overcome learned helplessness. Part of Marty Seligman, who developed actually this concept of learned helplessness, also tried to develop the concept of learned optimism. We have to try to help people see that they are not helpless. The cognitive triangle in cognitive behavioral therapy, you know, how your thoughts affect your feelings and your behavior. Well, none of us can control how we feel, but we do control what we think about and what we do. So we control our thoughts and our behavior. And that's what we need to do. We can be helpless in feeling like we can't control our feelings, or we have less power over that. But how we influence our feelings is by changing how we think and changing what we do. So that's something I think we need to do. We need to be able to, you know, think thoughts that are realistic but also kind. You know, I heard this example from somebody that said, you know, our tendency to talk to ourselves in negative ways, if you actually change that inner dialogue to a friend telling you, when something bad happens, you yourself might say, well, I'm a failure, I'm a loser, I can't do this. But your friend would say to you, you know what? There will be other opportunities. There's always tomorrow. So you need to be able to to think things and to behave in a way that helps improve your situation. And that also includes anxiety. We need to be able to overcome our fears. And how do we do that? We do that by reducing their perceived fears or challenges that we have and increasing our abilities. The difference between the two is what leads to anxiety. So anxiety is fear minus the ability to cope. The Harvard psychologist Susan Davis, who talks about stress, says there is a way to help manage it. One way is to name it, frame it, and I've added the word game it. So I think for those that can name it, the sense is a lot of people say, I am stressed. And what she suggests that you do is you say, instead of saying that because it makes you powerless, you say that I have stress. And in the context of framing it, it's to break it down into parts that you can deal with, compartmentalizing it. And so it's better to find out and identify the things that stress you. So you can say, rather than just I have stress, what stresses me is I can't sleep, I'm lonely, I miss my friends. The boundaries in my life are gone with the pandemic. And if I'm staying home, I'm a father, a mother, but also an employee, a husband, a wife. We're working, and the boundaries that used to separate us in our lives have blurred, and they may be gone. You may become a teacher, but you also need to do your work. So it's important for us to be aware and frame the things that stress us so we can overcome that. And that's the first step in framing it, is developing strategies or to game it to how to overcome it. So how do you overcome not being able to sleep? You have to practice good sleep hygiene. For those that are lonely, you have to connect with people. If you miss your friends, find a way to connect with them. And as far as boundaries, I think it's important for us to realize it is a tough time for many people. I think it's realizing that it's temporary, finding solutions that make things easier, setting boundaries that you can set in your home. So having time for school, for your kids, but also for work, setting a schedule, those are ways of helping to game it. Now, Mickey Csikszentmihalyi, he's the other person along with Marty Seligman that helped develop positive psychology. And one of the things he says is, in terms of happiness, an important thing is to match our challenges with our skills. I think if you have too much skills and not enough challenge, you'll have boredom. But if you have too much challenge and not enough skill, you'll have anxiety. And the way to seek happiness is to match our challenges with our skills. And in the context of a pandemic, use the challenge of the pandemic to match it with the skills that you have. A lot of people have spent time fixing up their homes or doing things at home that they would never have been able to do. So find ways to channel your skills so that you can learn to forget yourself and to find happiness. The sixth prescription is to find the need for meaning or purpose. Make your life count. What matters to you? The Austrian psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who I very much admire, once said, "A why can bear almost any how." And in it, what he was doing in quoting Nietzsche was saying, when a person has a reason to do something, it becomes much easier. As a person who lived through Auschwitz, he tried to be scientific, and he saw his wife died during the concentration camp, but he watched other people in the concentration camp he was in, and he tried to predict which ones would survive. It wasn't the biggest, the strongest, or the smartest people that survived. The people that survived were the people who had a reason to live, whether or not it was to be back with their families, or for God, or to get back at the Nazis. If they had a reason, they were much more likely to be able to do it. And he has this beautiful equation in his book which is that despair is suffering minus meaning. If you have a lot of meaning, it subtracts from the suffering in terms of despair. It makes things that seem impossible possible. And we actually do know this in terms of data. This is a study in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Meaning can actually be a matter of life and death. The more sense of meaning you have, the more longer you will live. The less likely you will be hospitalized. This is another study. And the mortality also in community dwelling persons also is demonstrably higher when those that have more sense of meaning. And for life stress in the time of COVID, it's the same thing. Those that had a higher crisis of meaning had higher COVID-19 stress and measures of depression. This is a cohort of about 1,600 people in Germany. The seventh prescription is to practice gratitude and realize grace and see life as a gift. This is a paper in the Scientific American that looked at why bronze medalists are happier than silver medalists. And they analyzed the facial patterns of people going up to podiums and those that forced their smiles and those that were not smiling at all. And people who were bronze medal winners obviously seemed happier than those that were silver medal winners. And you can see that I think the person who wins the bronze medal is just happy to be on the podium. They realize that they could have come in fourth. Whereas the person who is the silver medalist laments about the fact that they didn't win gold. So you can see that circumstances can affect how you feel, and it depends on your attitude about what you have. I would suggest a period of reflection on what you are grateful in your life. If you just spend a moment to think about 3 ways in which things could have been worse for you in this pandemic, I think it would be a way of you realizing in a reverse sense what you're grateful for. Because many of us realize that things could have been worse. I think it's important for us to think about what we've learned and what you would tell yourself if you could talk to yourself a couple years before. What have you learned from this pandemic? And I think there are silver linings in the pandemic if we search hard enough. For sure, there are a lot of people that are in different circumstances, but for many who could spend time with family or their immediate family, people got closer, which was potentially a beautiful thing. Now, the research by Sonia Lyubomirsky on gratitude journaling demonstrated in prospective studies that if you just take the time to gratitude journal once a week for 6 weeks, your level of overall satisfaction with your life will increase. Now, it's important, I think, if you do that on an ongoing basis, to find different things to be grateful for. And work by Robert Emmons also found that gratitude improves physical health, raises energy levels, and for patients with neuromuscular disease, relieves pain and fatigue. So it's side effect free, it's available for any of us to do. Just think about what you're grateful for. Because we forget, we don't think about the fact that every moment is a gift, including with the families and our friends that we have. Never more so than during this pandemic when we haven't been able to be together. I would suggest we cherish each moment and every person in your life, because you never know when it will be the last time you see someone. Life is fragile. I would encourage you to take nothing and no one for granted. And in many ways, time is like a river. You can't touch the water twice because the flow has passed and will never pass again. Enjoy every moment of your life, because once it passes, it will be gone. And we know that our lifespan isn't really known. We need to try to take advantage of what is guaranteed, which is the present moment. At one time, it won't be there anymore. And you need to ask the question, what really matters at the end of life? I've asked this of my patients. I am a geriatric psychiatrist and I work with the elderly. And I've often talked to them what they would change in their lives. And no one has ever told me they wish they had worked more. They usually wish they had spent more time with their family. And I think that's probably the similar thing that we realize at the end of this pandemic. We realize what we have been missing. And hopefully this will lead us to cherish it more and then find it when the pandemic is over, because the pandemic will be over. There's a saying, you can't do anything about the length of your life, but you can do something about its width and depth. I do believe there are two ways of viewing life. Life as a gift versus life as an entitlement. And, if I look at my own life, I'm 52 years old. I can look back and say I've had 52 years as a gift. I didn't do anything to deserve being born or being alive, but I am grateful for that. And I hope you can also look and say this about yourself, about what has been a gift to you, rather than saying you should be entitled to this or that. The equation happiness is the equivalent of wanting what you have divided by getting what you want. If you want what you already have, you can be happy. And that is the definition of gratitude. I think life does humble us as we age. You realize how much time you spend on nonsense. I realize that I'm in my 5th decade and I can see this for myself, but I think my patients have many times have told me too that things become more clearly in focus as life goes on. And this pandemic, I think, has also helped us focus. I heard a talk by a palliative care physician, and he, in talking about palliative care, said, we need to live not in spite of death, but because of death. It helps us focus. And I think in terms of the pandemic, we need to find the good, not in spite of the pandemic, but because of it. The pandemic can help us if we are there to search and discover hidden opportunities and things that will help us grow. And on this anniversary of Mark Twain's death, I'll end this presentation with a quote from him. There isn't time, so brief is life, for bickering, apologies, heart-burnings, or callings to account. There is only time for loving, and but an instant, so to speak, for that. And that's a quote from Mark Twain. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to one day meet with you and to share our stories together. Thank you.